Welcome to the deep dive. You know, in a world where conflicts often feel, well, stubbornly intractable, we're actually seeing some truly surprising, maybe even ambitious diplomatic moves emerging this
Hey,
August.
quite something.
Yeah, we've got a fascinating deep dive ahead of us today. We're going to try and cut through the noise, really get into recent peace efforts and two major global flashpoints. First, the long-standing Armenia-Azerbaijan dispute, which remarkably just saw a groundbreaking agreement
A
signed.
huge development.
And second, the ongoing, incredibly complex Russia-Ukraine war. Former President Donald Trump is floating some very specific and, let's be honest, highly controversial proposals there. And this is all happening just ahead of a really high-stakes meeting he's got scheduled with Vladimir Putin.
What's truly fascinating here, I think, is the sheer ambition underpinning these diplomatic pushes. They really do challenge long-held assumptions about how these conflicts might finally, well, wind down. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it really raises an important question, doesn't it? About the evolving, maybe increasingly individual, role-specific leaders are playing in global diplomacy today.
That's a great point. And for this deep dive, where are we pulling our information from?
So we're primarily pulling insights from recent articles published around August 2025 by Barackface. They're a leading geopolitical analysis firm known for their really in-depth coverage of these kinds of issues, these specific peace proposals, and of course the upcoming Trump-Putin meeting.
Right. So our mission today is to help you, our listener, grasp the real implications, the potential future paths for these situations. We want to break down these complex negotiations, look at their potential impacts, and really explore that intricate web of geopolitical interests that define these critical moments.
Absolutely.
We want you walking away well-informed on what's really driving these discussions and why they matter so profoundly.
And to truly make sense of all this complex information, we really need to dig into the details. Understanding the historical context isn't just helpful.
Oh, it's vital.
It's absolutely vital for critical thinking here. This isn't just about skimming headlines. It's about discerning the intricate dance of power and diplomacy playing out on the global stage.
Okay, so let's begin our deep dive with a region that often feels like well, a historical echo chamber, but is now right at the center of a truly historic breakthrough, the South Caucasus, specifically that Armenia-Azerbaijan peace deal that was just signed.
Indeed. And to truly appreciate the significance of this agreement, we really have to start at the very beginning. We need to trace the deep roots of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. It's a dispute fundamentally embedded in history, reaching way back to the early 20th century.
This is where the deep history really matters, like you said. This isn't just about lines on a map. It's a conflict steeped in decades of history, simmering ethnic tensions and powerful external influences. The mountainous enclave of Nagorno-Karabakh, for instance. Majority ethnic Armenian population, right? Yet, a hugely controversial Soviet-era decision back in 1923, under Joseph Stalin no less, designated it as an autonomous oblast within the Azerbaijan Soviet Socialist Republic.
Despite Armenian calls for unification.
Exactly. Despite fervent calls from Armenians for unification with Armenia, that single administrative stroke, you could argue, sowed decades of simmering discontent that would eventually just explode as the Soviet Union began to crumble.
And those seeds of discontent, they truly blossomed into full-scale conflict as the Soviet Union unraveled in the late 1980s. By '88, ethnic Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh began demanding transfer to Armenia.
Right.
And that quickly led to widespread protests, violent pogroms, escalating clashes on both sides.
Yeah.
When the USSR finally dissolved in 1991, the whole situation just exploded into what became known as the First Nagorno-Karabakh War, a really brutal conflict that lasted until 1994.
And that initial war was absolutely devastating. We're talking an estimated 30,000 lives lost.
Horrific cost.
Truly horrific human cost, yeah. And hundreds of thousands of people displaced. During that conflict, Armenian forces managed to gain control not only of Nagorno-Karabakh itself, but also 7 surrounding Azerbaijani districts.
Right, creating that buffer zone.
Effectively creating a de facto independent republic, which was, of course, heavily backed by Armenia. Now, a Russia-brokered ceasefire in '94 managed to freeze the conflict
Freeze but not resolve.
Exactly. It certainly didn't bring permanent peace. It led to sporadic skirmishes that just continued for years, a constant reminder of all those unresolved issues bubbling under the surface.
And this really raises a crucial question about how profoundly historical grievances impact modern negotiations. I mean, the sheer scale of displacement, you mentioned the hundreds of thousands back then, but even recently, over 100,000 ethnic Armenians fleeing just in 2023 alone. That underscores the immense human cost that any peace deal must genuinely contend with.
Absolutely.
We saw renewed hostilities erupt with the Second Nagorno-Karabakh War in 2020. Azerbaijan, having significantly modernized its military crucial backing from Turkish drones, was key there.
Game changer, those drones.
Absolutely. They recaptured much of the occupied territories in a rapid, decisive 44-day offensive. A Russian-mediated truce again brought a halt to that fighting, and Russian peacekeepers were subsequently deployed to Nagorno-Karabakh, ostensibly to, well, maintain the peace.
But even that truce proved tragically fragile, didn't it? September 2023, Azerbaijan launches another swift offensive, and this time they fully seize the entire Nagorno-Karabakh region.
The whole thing.
Yeah. And this triggered a truly heartbreaking mass exodus. Over 100,000 ethnic Armenians fled to Armenia, leaving Azerbaijan firmly in control. But it still left borders largely undefined. Ongoing skirmishes continued to plague the region. It just demonstrated that even after decades of conflict, the human toll remains immense and the underlying tensions are just so persistent.
That background really sets the stage, doesn't it, for understanding this recent breakthrough? Which, as you pointed out, didn't just happen overnight. It was the culmination of many, many years of effort.
No, it certainly wasn't. The path to this current agreement was incredibly arduous. I mean, literally years of failed negotiations under various international mediators. Russia, the EU, the US. They all took turns trying to broker peace, often with very little to show for it.
A lot of stalled efforts.
Yeah. By early 2025, there were reports that Armenia and Azerbaijan had reportedly agreed on much of a draft peace treaty text. But crucial sticking points like precise border delimitation, constitutional claims implying territorial aims, the unresolved status of various transport corridors, they just kept progress stalled. A final deal seemed perpetually out of reach.
So the stage was kind of set for a new approach, right? A fresh impetus. And that's precisely where President Trump entered the scene with a very specific kind of diplomatic push.
Exactly. The breakthrough came under the Trump administration. After his election in 2024, Trump had positioned himself as a president of peace, reportedly building on other foreign policy accords he'd brokered earlier in his term. U.S. diplomats really leaned into a bilateral deal, emphasizing significant economic incentives, new strategic alignments that could benefit both nations.
Putting pressure on economically.
Right. In July 2025, a U.S.-brokered framework started to emerge, which eventually culminated in that White House summit on August 8th. And at that summit, Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan and Azerbaijani President Ilham Aliyev signed the accord right there in Trump's presence. And importantly, the U.S. secured some key concessions itself, including exclusive development rights to a crucial transit corridor, which I know we'll get to.
Yes, definitely.
This deal, according to our sources at Barackface, aligns with Trump's broader agenda, which apparently includes potential expansion of the Abraham Accords to include Azerbaijan.
Interesting connection there.
Yeah. And external pressures also played a big role, like Armenia's noticeable pivot away from Russia due to perceived lack of support, and Azerbaijan's growing energy leverage in the region, especially important for Europe now.
So this brings us directly to the core provisions of what's being called the Agreement on Peace and Establishment of Interstate Relations. What are the foundational elements here, the things that truly redefine the relationship on paper?
Okay, so what does this all mean for the region and for you listening to this deep dive? We're looking at a foundational agreement, not just some temporary ceasefire. One of the most significant provisions, arguably the bedrock of the whole deal, is mutual recognition and border delimitation.
Finally getting those lines drawn.
Exactly. Both Armenia and Azerbaijan have now officially recognized each other's territorial integrity based on the Soviet-era borders. This formally and definitively resolves those long-standing claims over Nagorno-Karabakh, which is now explicitly and fully under Azerbaijani control. They've also committed to joint commissions to finalize the precise delimitation of these borders, which is just, well, it's a massive step towards long-term stability.
And that's such a critical point for any lasting peace, isn't it? Defining clear boundaries, where before there was just ambiguity, and that ambiguity repeatedly fueled conflict. But the real game changer here, maybe both economically and geopolitically, is the corridor, right?
Absolutely. The Trump route for international peace and prosperity, or TRIPP corridor as it's being called,
Yep.
that's the standout element. This is essentially the Zangezur corridor we've heard about for years. It links mainland Azerbaijan to its Nakhchivan exclave, that autonomous republic geographically separated from the rest of Azerbaijan, right, through southern Armenia.
Okay.
But here's the crucial twist. The U.S. gains exclusive development rights and a 99-year lease for this corridor.
Wow, 99 years.
Yeah, and even though the U.S. is developing it, it remains under Armenian sovereignty. That's a really key concession for Armenia, preserving their territorial integrity on paper. Its aim, they say, is to significantly enhance regional trade, energy transit, overall connectivity, potentially transforming the South Caucasus into a vital Europe-Asia link.
The economic implications of that corridor are just vast. Think of it like this. For decades, Russia has basically been the main highway through this region, controlling the flows.
Right.
Now, suddenly, there's a brand new, potentially faster bypass being built, one they have absolutely no control over and get no tolls from, so to speak. This could fundamentally reshape global trade and energy flows. It forces a reevaluation of Russia's long-term economic and energy strategy.
Yeah.
And that shift reverberates far beyond the Caucasus, potentially accelerating Moscow's economic isolation.
So beyond that massive economic shift with the corridor, what else is in the agreement? What are the other key pieces?
Well, the agreement also includes critical provisions for security and demilitarization. This means withdrawal of forces from disputed areas, a firm commitment to no foreign military bases except for existing Russian ones, which are now explicitly under review, signaling a potential shift there too.
Interesting caveat.
Very interesting. And mechanisms for prisoner exchanges and mine clearance, a huge humanitarian need in a region just scarred by decades of conflict. There's also a significant focus on broader economic and humanitarian cooperation, things like opening borders for trade, joint infrastructure projects, and vital support for displaced persons, addressing that human cost we talked about.
Right, trying to heal some wounds.
And a very significant political step for Armenia. They've agreed to hold a constitutional referendum by 2027 to remove any references that could imply territorial claims on Azerbaijan. That signals a definitive move towards fully accepting the new reality on the ground.
And for an ambitious deal like this to actually hold, especially given the history of broken ceasefires, international backing is essential, right?
Oh, absolutely crucial. The agreement is backed by the U.S., naturally, but with crucial endorsements from both the EU and, notably, Russia as well.
Even Russia.
Even Russia, though perhaps cautiously. This broad international support is intended to ensure strict implementation timelines for signing, ratification, ongoing monitoring. Now, it's important to note, it's currently an initialed framework, not yet a fully ratified treaty.
Okay, still a step.
But it's undeniably seen as a significant milestone towards true normalization, potentially redefining a decades-long conflict.
So this really sounds like a massive diplomatic victory for one particular player, the U.S., while potentially sidelining others quite significantly. When we talk about geopolitical chess, it feels like the board just got dramatically rearranged.
Absolutely. And that's precisely where the geopolitical ripple effects become most apparent. This agreement fundamentally reshapes the traditional power dynamics in the South Caucasus. It marks a significant, tangible win for U.S. influence in a region where, frankly, it previously played a more limited role compared to others.
So, while one player, the U.S., celebrates a significant diplomatic win, two other regional heavyweights seem to be feeling the pinch. What this deal truly exposes isn't just a loss of influence for Russia and Iran, but maybe a stark new reality. Russia's diminishing capacity to dictate terms in its own backyard, especially post-Ukraine.
That's a key factor.
It feels like a clear signal that the geopolitical chessboard in the South Caucasus has fundamentally flipped. But this raises an important question for you, our listener. What about the long-term stability of the region when key actors feel marginalized? While the U.S. sees it as a strategic gain, these shifts could easily create new, unforeseen tensions down the line. We're specifically talking about Russia and Iran here, right? They're widely seen as the losers in this new arrangement.
That's the common analysis, yes. The overall impact for them appears to be a noticeable loss of influence, a reduction in their economic leverage, and a significant hit to their strategic positioning in the South Caucasus.
Okay, let's start with Russia. They've historically been the primary mediator, the main power broker in this region for centuries, long before the Soviet Union even existed.
Absolutely, the traditional arbiter.
They brokered the ceasefires in '94 and 2020, even deployed peacekeepers after the last one. But how is this new U.S.-led deal impacting their role now?
It's a significant blow to President Vladimir Putin, certainly. From a diplomatic perspective, this new U.S.-led deal effectively bypasses Moscow. It marks a significant erosion of Russia's traditional influence in the post-Soviet sphere, an influence that, as you mentioned, has already reportedly waned considerably since the 2022 invasion of Ukraine.
So their diplomatic clout, once sort of unrivaled in this part of the world, is really eroding.
Precisely. The agreement specifically dissolves the OSCE Minsk group, for instance. For decades, that group, co-chaired by Russia, France, and the U.S., was the primary international framework for negotiations.
Right, the main form.
Its dissolution is a clear sign that Russia's long-standing role as the central arbiter is effectively over. Russian officials, like Konstantin Zatulin, have openly stated their concerns. He noted that this deal squeezes Russia out of the Caucasus, and even went so far as to warn that Russia's military base in Armenia, a key strategic asset for them, now hangs by a thread.
Wow, hangs by a thread. That's a strong statement. And then there's the economic aspect, particularly concerning that TPP corridor. How does that hit Russia?
The control over trade and transit is another major area of loss. Moscow had actively sought a peacekeeping role, and thus a share of control, in any such corridor through Armenia. But the U.S., they secured exclusive development rights for up to 99 years.
Locked it down?
Pretty much. This effectively cuts Russia out from profiting from it or controlling this crucial link. This new corridor is expected to significantly bolster the middle corridor trade route, that's the one linking Europe to Central Asia, while completely bypassing Russian territory. This directly reduces Moscow's leverage over vital energy and goods flows. It's a substantial economic blow.
And Armenia itself, traditionally a staunch ally of Russia, part of their security bloc, seems to be shifting its allegiances, almost accelerating that pivot westward.
That's a key part of Russia's overall loss of influence here. Armenia has historically relied heavily on Russia for its security, especially through the Collective Security Treaty Organization, the CSTO, Russia's own military alliance, kind of like their NATO.
Right.
However, there's been growing disillusionment in Yerevan, especially after what they perceived as Russian inaction during Azerbaijan's 2023 offensive. This new deal, offering U.S. backing and economic opportunities, seems to accelerate Armenia's shift toward the West. We're seeing talk of potential EU aspirations, growing security ties with the U.S. All of this further isolates Russia in the region.
So how is Moscow reacting publicly?
Well, Moscow has issued some cautious, welcome statements for the peace itself, but they've also quickly warned against foreign meddling, which clearly signals their deep unease with this new geopolitical reality. U.S. officials, on the other hand, have actually framed this as a clear win for the West, explicitly calling Russia, along with China and Iran, the losers in reshaping regional dynamics.
So if Russia's feeling the heat, Iran must be too, right? Given their shared borders and historical influence in the region.
They absolutely are. Iran shares borders with both Armenia and Azerbaijan and has historically tried to, carefully balance relations with both to maintain its influence in the South Caucasus. The deal is seen in Tehran as a direct, almost existential threat, to the point where they've publicly vowed to block the corridor with or without Russia's help.
Really? That's strong language, too. What are their specific concerns? Beyond just general opposition, what are the details that worry them so much?
Well, the geopolitical encroachment near their borders is paramount. The Zangezur corridor, now the TPP, runs directly along Iran's northern border. Tehran strongly opposes any changes that could alter borders or fragment Armenia, as this can severely restrict Iran's access to Armenia and potentially cut off its routes to the Black Sea and Europe via Georgia.
Okay, strategic access.
Exactly. Iranian officials have even labeled the U.S. lease as neo-imperialism and a significant security risk. They fear it could enable greater Turkish or even Israeli influence, given Azerbaijan's pro-Western stance and developing ties with Israel, in what is a very, very sensitive area for Iranian security. It's not just about trade routes, it's about their strategic depth, their regional security architecture being threatened.
So it's not just about losing out on potential trade, it's about their fundamental strategic position being compromised.
Precisely. It also represents a significant reduction in their sphere of influence. The agreement pulls Armenia further out of the traditional Russian-Iranian sphere, weakening a bloc that has generally countered Western and Turkish expansion in the region. Iran has consistently always opposed the corridor concept, viewing it as foreign intervention that undermines regional stability. With Azerbaijan strengthening ties to the U.S. and Turkey, Iran loses significant leverage in energy transit and even ethnic dynamics, particularly concerning pan-Turkic sentiments among its own Azerbaijani minority within Iran. That's a very complex internal issue for Tehran.
Right, internal sensitivities too. And what about the direct economic and security blows? How tangible are those for Iran?
The corridor could dramatically reroute existing oil, gas, and goods flows, bypassing Iran entirely and boosting its regional competitors. Tehran has, as I mentioned, even threatened military action if necessary to prevent its construction. But with Russia so heavily preoccupied in Ukraine, Iran may find itself increasingly isolated on this front. Iranian officials are very clear in their opposition to what they call geopolitical changes near their borders. You can sense a clear and palpable fear of encirclement, with this new corridor viewed as a key piece of that puzzle.
So summarizing that part, this deal really represents a new U.S. strategic foothold in a historically volatile region, directly diminishing Russia and Iran's traditional dominance.
That's the takeaway. While both countries have offered carefully measured support for peace itself, their underlying opposition is deeply rooted in losing control over a key crossroads of trade, energy, and politics.
That's a huge shift in the South Caucasus. And it leads us directly to another major geopolitical hotspot. Let's pivot now from Armenia and Azerbaijan to Eastern Europe, where President Trump is floating an equally controversial, maybe even more controversial path to peace in the Russia-Ukraine war.
A very different kind of proposal.
Now, this isn't just a general call for peace. It's a very specific and highly contentious proposal for how to achieve it. Ahead of his high-stakes meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Alaska, scheduled for August 15th, 2025, so just days away, President Donald Trump has been hinting strongly at a land swap or territorial exchanges as a resolution to the Russia-Ukraine war. Trump's stated primary goal, he says, is securing a path to peace and trying to get back territory for Ukraine, while also acknowledging that such exchanges could have both good and bad outcomes. The presumed formula, based on various reports and analyses from our sources like Barackface, seems to be that Crimea, Donetsk, and Luhansk would officially go to Russia, with the rest of Ukraine retaining its international recognized borders.
This approach certainly signals a readiness to consider unconventional, almost transactional solutions to conflict. But it comes with such a deep history of conflict, very firm and often irreconcilable positions from both sides, and profound implications for international law.
This viewpoint really highlights a fundamental tension for you to consider, doesn't it? The desire for a swift end to conflict versus the bedrock principle of national territorial integrity. It suggests a certain impatience, maybe, with the current state of affairs and Ukraine's unwavering stance.
Definitely a clash of principles.
Trump has publicly voiced his dissatisfaction with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's resistance to these kinds of ideas, implying that Ukraine's objections are hindering peace efforts. He's even gone so far as to suggest that Zelensky might need approval, perhaps implying Western pressure to consider alternatives. This aligns with Trump's broader framing of the war as a very costly endeavor for U.S. taxpayers.
The cost argument, yeah.
And it's also been reported that Trump has privately suggested Ukraine might need to concede some territory, including Crimea, just to facilitate a resolution.
This raises that important question again about the practicalities, the moral implications, and the precedents these scenarios would set. Each one carries a different set of risks and potential rewards, not just for the immediate parties, but for the broader international legal framework. Now, while the specifics of a potential land swap remain speculative, various reports, analyses, leaks from Trump's team suggest several possible configurations.
Okay.
The general idea behind these scenarios seems to be freezing the current front lines and strategically utilizing Ukraine's recent territorial gains in Russia's Kursk region, that was about 700 to 1,000 square kilometers captured back in August 2024, as bargaining chips.
Using Kursk as leverage.
Exactly. Leverage against Russia's far more substantial occupation of roughly 20% of Ukrainian territory, which includes places like Donbass, Donetsk, and Luhansk, Crimea, parts of Kherson, and Zaporizhia.
So what are the different ways this swap could actually play out, hypothetically, if it were to happen?
Well, one scenario that's been discussed is an asymmetric concession favoring Russia. In this highly debated model, Ukraine might formally cede control of Crimea and the entire Donbass region, Luhansk and Donetsk, to Russia.
Wow, okay.
In return, Russia would potentially withdraw from the very limited territory it holds in Kursk that Ukraine had seized. The analysis of this scenario suggests it would mean Russia retaining the vast majority of its territorial gains. We're talking around 100,000 square kilometers of Ukrainian land, while returning only minor, strategically less significant areas.
And what would Ukraine get out of that, besides stopping the fighting?
Well, the incentives in this grim scenario could include sanctions relief for Russia, which would be a major incentive for Moscow, obviously, and, crucially, Western reconstruction funds for the Ukrainian regions not ceded. However, critics vehemently argue this would effectively reward Russia's invasion by formalizing its illegal annexations without any full international recognition. It fundamentally undermines international law.
Seems like it.
Ukraine would achieve a nominal peace, but at the immense cost of losing strategically vital and resource-rich territories, and it sets a dangerous precedent for future aggression globally.
That certainly sounds like a very, very tough pill for Ukraine to swallow. It seems to largely legitimize Russia's territorial gains through force. Is there a more balanced option being considered, even theoretically?
There's also the theoretical idea of a balanced land-for-land exchange. This scenario would indeed be more equitable, at least on paper. Russia would retain Donbass and Crimea, though crucially, without formal international recognition of their annexation.
Okay, that's a key difference.
A very key difference. In return, Russia would entirely withdraw from Kursk, and Ukraine would regain significant portions of Kherson and Zaporizhia oblasts, thousands of square kilometers, territory vital for Ukraine's economy and security. This could also include disarmament clauses for Ukraine, limiting its future military posture, and specific security guarantees from international partners to ensure its long-term safety.
And funding. Sanctions.
Western funding would then be specifically allocated to rebuild the liberated regions, and sanctions on Russia would be lifted once compliance is fully achieved. Now, while it's more balanced than the first scenario, it still involves Ukraine conceding occupied territory. And it still struggles with the principle of international law, as it implies a willingness to exchange sovereign land seized through force.
Right. Still problematic, legally and morally. And what if it's less about these grand sweeping swaps and more about just freezing the current reality on the ground, making minor tweaks?
That brings us to the frozen lines with minor adjustments scenario. Here, the current front lines would largely remain intact and serve as a de facto border. Any swaps would be limited to small, tactical territorial adjustments made for strategic or humanitarian reasons, maybe ensuring access to vital water resources, or accommodating specific population centers currently cut in half by the fighting.
Practical adjustments.
Practical adjustments. Under this scenario, Russia would retain its core gains, while Ukraine would exit Kursk. The deal could also include immediate comprehensive ceasefires, large-scale prisoner exchanges, and potentially a commitment that Ukraine would not seek NATO membership in the near future, addressing one of Russia's long-standing security concerns. But again, critics of any of these scenarios consistently argue that such a swap inherently favors Russia. Why? Because it would involve Ukraine trading its internationally recognized sovereign land for territory it temporarily controls but ultimately belongs to Russia, thereby potentially undermining international norms against territorial aggression and the UN Charter itself.
Given all this, how is Ukraine reacting to these proposals being floated? It feels like an immediate and strong rejection is almost inevitable from Kyiv.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Ukraine's stance isn't just about the physical territory. It's fundamentally about international norms, the very principle of national sovereignty, and frankly, the future of the global order. Ukraine is highly unlikely to willingly entertain such a proposal. President Zelensky has repeatedly, unequivocally rejected any notion of ceding territory.
His red line.
Absolutely, insisting that any just and lasting peace must restore Ukraine's internationally recognized borders from 1991. He views any land swaps as directly rewarding Russian aggression, and he has criticized Trump's suggestions as unrealistic and dangerous, emphasizing that Ukraine holds no significant Russian land to swap other than those symbolic Kursk gains, which were more tactical incursions than actual territorial conquests meant for trading.
And what's the sentiment like within Ukraine itself, among the people who've suffered so much?
Public sentiment in Ukraine strongly opposes territorial concessions. Polls reportedly show that over 80% of Ukrainians are against giving up any land. This isn't just abstract principle. It's deeply tied to national identity and the immense sacrifices made over the last few years.
Of course.
The Ukrainian government also views such proposals as a profound betrayal of the Budapest Memorandum. That was signed back in 1994.
Where they gave up nukes.
Exactly. Under which Ukraine gave up its vast nuclear arsenal, the third largest in the world at the time, in exchange for security assurances from global powers, including the US, Russia, and the UK, specifically against threats to its territorial integrity. Now, could intense US pressure under Trump potentially force negotiations? Maybe, especially if military aid were threatened, a significant concern for Kyiv.
The leverage point.
But Ukraine's leadership has clearly signaled it would prefer to continue fighting rather than accept a deal that legitimizes occupation. They understand this could provoke widespread domestic unrest, severely destabilize their government, or just lead to a prolonged, unstable stalemate, not genuine peace.
And what about Ukraine's European allies? Are they on board with these kinds of land swap ideas?
Not at all. European allies, including those within the European Union, have expressed significant concerns over these proposals. They fear that any territorial concessions, especially under duress, would embolden Russia further. They worry it sets a very dangerous precedent that undermines the sovereignty of nations everywhere and could embolden other aggressors worldwide, potentially even China, regarding Taiwan.
Wider implication.
Exactly. They view such a potential deal as a fundamental challenge to the international rules-based order that underpins global stability. They are very wary of anything that could be perceived as a peace at any cost approach, especially if that cost means legitimizing aggression.
Okay, so here's the big one then. A face-to-face meeting between the leaders of two nuclear-armed superpowers happening in just a few days. Amidst these deeply entrenched conflicts and these really controversial peace proposals, the announcement of a direct in-person meeting between U.S. President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin, well, it's ignited significant debate globally.
Understandably so.
Scheduled for August 15th, 2025 in Alaska. The summit aims to discuss potential pathways to resolving the conflict in Ukraine, all against the backdrop of Russia's continued aggression and Ukraine's steadfast resistance. The core question for all of us, then, isn't just what they'll discuss, but whether such a meeting, regardless of specific outcomes, is inherently beneficial or just fraught with unacceptable risks.
What's fascinating here is how these arguments tie into core diplomatic theories, particularly the realist school of thought. Thinkers like Henry Kissinger often emphasized leader-to-leader talks as essential for managing great power relations, even adversarial ones. Arguments in favor, for instance, suggest that direct dialogue between leaders of nuclear-armed superpowers like the U.S. and Russia is often seen as a cornerstone of international relations, even in adversarial contexts like this.
But how does that direct dialogue actually help in such high-stakes situations where the mistrust runs so incredibly deep?
Well, firstly, it significantly reduces the risk of miscalculation and escalation. In times of intense conflict and these proxy dynamics we see, misunderstandings can so easily lead to unintended escalations. Face-to-face meetings allow for clearer communication, the subtle reading of body language, even building some informal rapport that you simply cannot replicate through virtual calls or intermediaries.
Like reading the room.
Exactly. We've seen this historically. The 1986 Reykjavik summit between Reagan and Gorbachev, for example. It didn't yield an immediate deal, but it truly paved the way for future arms control agreements by fostering mutual understanding and, well, a degree of trust. Similarly, Trump's previous meetings with North Korea's Kim Jong-un, despite all the criticism, did help de-escalate tensions on the Korean peninsula at the time.
Okay.
In the current Ukraine context, where proxy dynamics and nuclear saber-rattling persist, a personal encounter could be crucial in clarifying red lines and preventing accidental clashes that could spiral completely out of control.
So it's about reducing the temperature, making sure vital lines aren't accidentally crossed. What about actually opening up pathways to diplomacy and maybe a real peace? Is that realistic here?
Fundamentally, for many diplomats, talking is preferable to not talking, especially in conflicts of this scale. The summit itself signals a willingness to engage, which could restart stalled negotiations. Now, while Putin has reportedly used ceasefire proposals strategically in the past, maybe just to buy time,
A common tactic.
Trump's direct involvement might shift dynamics by introducing new U.S. leverage. Things like the potential for sanctions relief or explicit security guarantees in exchange for Russian concessions. Experts note that while Russia often employs talks to buy time, the alternative, which has been Russia's relative isolation, has arguably only prolonged the war. If this summit leads to even incremental progress, maybe establishing more robust humanitarian corridors, larger prisoner swaps, it would directly benefit civilians on the ground. And while Ukrainian President Zelensky has rightly emphasized standing firm on Ukrainian positions, excluding direct U.S.-Russia dialogue entirely could, paradoxically, further isolate Ukraine from crucial top-level discussions about its own future, potentially forcing their hand later on.
And there's also a significant symbolic aspect to these high-level meetings, isn't there? A message it sends to the rest of the world.
Absolutely. The symbolic value and the impact on global stability are incredibly important considerations. Hosting the summit in Alaska, neutral U.S. territory with historical ties to Russia, underscores a pragmatic approach over pure confrontation. This can reassure both allies and adversaries that superpowers are actively managing their rivalry responsibly, rather than just letting tensions spiral.
Showing leadership, maybe?
In today's multipolar world, especially with China watching closely and actively seeking to expand its own influence, such meetings help prevent power vacuums that other actors might be tempted to exploit, potentially leading to new instabilities. Public sentiment on social media also shows some, perhaps cautious, optimism for these peace talks, with users highlighting the desperate need for dialogue to end the profound human suffering. In essence, the argument for the good of this meeting rests on the principle that engagement, no matter how imperfect or challenging, is often a necessary first step toward resolution in a conflict that has claimed tens of thousands of lives and severely disrupted global economies and food supplies.
Okay, so on the flip side then, what are the significant concerns? The arguments against this meeting being a good thing. Are we risking legitimizing actions that violate international norms? And what's the cost of potentially alienating key allies in the process? Critics argue, conversely, that such a meeting carries substantial, maybe even unacceptable risks, potentially legitimizing aggressive behavior and undermining fundamental international norms.
Exactly. The potential for such a meeting to legitimize Russian aggression and effectively bypass Ukraine is a primary concern for many observers. By meeting bilaterally, without Ukrainian President Zelensky present, the summit could inadvertently signal that major powers have the right to dictate the fates of smaller nations.
The spheres of influence worry.
Precisely. It's seen by many as a dangerous throwback to spheres of influence diplomacy, reminiscent of the Yalta Conference in 1945, which divided Europe into distinct blocs without full input from the affected countries themselves.
So Ukraine fears being treated, as you said earlier, not as a sovereign nation making its own choices, but as a pawn in a larger game between superpowers.
Precisely. Ukrainians have already expressed significant dismay. They view such a summit as a potential slow defeat, where concessions, maybe like ceding the Donbass region, might be floated without their consent or direct participation. President Zelensky has repeatedly warned that any ceasefire or deal favoring Moscow could simply invite a future reinvasion. He echoes analyses that Russia has a history of violating agreements when there aren't strong, verifiable enforcement mechanisms.
Trust is low.
Very low. This meeting format, therefore, risks portraying Ukraine not as a sovereign actor with agency, but merely as a pawn in a larger geopolitical game. That could severely damage their morale and their international standing.
And what about the impact on alliances like NATO and the potential for unequal outcomes in the negotiation itself? How do those concerns factor in?
Those are also major concerns, particularly for NATO allies and European partners.
Yeah.
Trump's history with Putin, including past instances of public praise, his perceived deferential appearance at the 2018 Helsinki summit, raises fears about potentially imbalanced negotiations.
The optics matter.
They do. Critics worry this could lead to an unfavorable land swap or the dilution of existing sanctions, which in turn could significantly erode NATO unity and embolden other aggressors worldwide, think in China, regarding Taiwan again. European leaders, many of whom are meeting separately around this time, have already voiced their skepticism. They view this as primarily a U.S.-Russia bilateral meeting that could sideline legitimate EU interests and concerns, potentially weakening the transatlantic alliance.
Yeah.
Social media reactions also highlight widespread fears of Trump just putting on a show for his domestic base while yielding no real progress, which could ironically further Putin's strategic goals by dividing the West.
Beyond the immediate geopolitical concerns, are there also opportunity costs or domestic consequences back in the U.S. that worry critics of this meeting?
Yes, there are significant opportunity costs to consider. High-profile summits like this can often divert valuable resources and diplomatic attention away from multilateral forums like the UN or the G7, where accountability mechanisms are generally stronger and more inclusive. Domestically, in the United States, such a meeting could intensely polarize public opinion.
Definitely divisive.
Some might view it as a failure even before it begins, fueling internal discord and political fragmentation, making it harder to forge a unified foreign policy down the line. If no concrete deal emerges, it might just harden positions on both sides, making future peace efforts even more difficult. And critically, if a bad deal results one perceived as unjust or against core principles, it could actually prolong the suffering of those directly impacted by the conflict by embedding an unstable, unsustainable peace rather than achieving genuine resolution. These points really highlight that such meetings aren't neutral. They carry inherent risks of moral hazard and significant strategic disadvantage if not managed very, very carefully.
So it's a real tightrope walk.
If we connect this back to the bigger picture, the efficacy of such a meeting isn't just about what's said, is it? It's about what's done afterward and how it's perceived by all stakeholders. It's truly a high-wire act where the potential for misstep is considerable. To analyze this objectively, we should really consider it through multiple lenses, starting with diplomatic theory. As we discussed, this meeting undeniably leans towards that realist approach in international relations, emphasizing leader-to-leader talks for power balancing, de-escalation, focusing on practical outcomes.
Pragmatism over principle, maybe?
Sometimes, yes. While this can be effective for short-term de-escalation, it may be weaker on delivering long-term justice or upholding international norms. Historical results from such high-level summits are mixed. Nixon's 1972 Moscow summit did thaw U.S.-Soviet relations, but Obama's attempt at a reset with Russia faltered notably amid the Crimea annexation, showing that context and intent are absolutely everything.
So it's a balance of immediate practical benefit versus the long-term consequence for international norms. What about the specific context of the Ukraine war itself right now in August 2025?
The Ukraine war, now tragically in its third year, absolutely demands innovative approaches because the human cost is just immense. However, Putin's core goals, which seem to include territorial gains, regime change in Kyiv is likely still on the table, weakening NATO, they fundamentally clash with U.S. aims of upholding Ukrainian sovereignty and international law. So, all else being equal, the goodness of this meeting hinges entirely on its true intent.
Intent versus optics.
Exactly. If it's a genuine outreach aimed at achieving a just and sustainable peace, then maybe it could advance that cause. But if it's primarily a performative act designed to gain political leverage or simply delay accountability for Russia, then it risks prolonging the conflict and the suffering. Public reactions on platforms like X, formerly Twitter, reveal this deep divide. There's a strong pro-peace optimism on one side, but also profound fears of betrayal on the other, mirroring these global splits.
How, then, can we measure the success or failure of such a meeting in a truly objective, nonpartisan way, looking beyond just the headlines and the spin?
We need objective, nonpartisan metrics. We measure good by tangible outcomes. Is there reduced violence? Are international norms upheld? And critically, are all relevant stakeholders included? Excluding Ukraine from direct discussions certainly tilts against a positive outcome, as it undermines the very nation whose future is being discussed.
A glaring omission.
Absolutely. However, if this meeting somehow catalyzes broader, more inclusive talks down the line, perhaps leading to a comprehensive peace framework, then it could be seen as a net positive. Our sources at Barackface provided a helpful way to visualize this tension, looking at different metrics side by side. For short-term stability, proponents argue a meeting brings high stability by reducing immediate tension, while critics warn it could bring low stability by legitimizing aggression, potentially inviting more later. On long-term peace, proponents see a high potential for progress, while critics fear a low potential, leading to an unstable, unjust peace. When we look at moral normative impact, proponents often argue it's neutral, focusing on pragmatism. But critics firmly state it's low, as it may normalize aggression.
Right.
And for global alliances, proponents suggest it's high, reassuring partners through dialogue, while critics warn it's low, risking the erosion of unity if concessions are made without consultation. This really illustrates the inherent tension between practical de-escalation and upholding international principles.
A fundamental conflict there.
The broader implications are vast, impacting everything from global energy markets and migration patterns to the critical issue of nuclear proliferation and the very future of international law. The available analysis, which we're trying to break down here, suggests a balanced but cautious outlook. There are potential upsides in opening lines of dialogue, but these are significantly tempered by the structural downsides of potentially legitimizing aggression or undermining critical alliances.
So what does this all mean for you as a global citizen tracking these monumental shifts? We've explored some incredibly ambitious diplomatic efforts that truly could redefine regional stability. From that landmark Armenia-Azerbaijan peace deal, which has really reshaped power in the South Caucasus, to the highly controversial land swap proposals for Ukraine and this impending high-stakes Trump-Putin summit, it's a lot to take in, but absolutely crucial for understanding our interconnected world.
This raises an important question that I hope you, our listener, continue to ponder as these events unfold. In an era of shifting global power, what kind of peace is truly sustainable? Is it one negotiated primarily from a position of strength and concession, where weaker parties inevitably bear the brunt?
Or something else?
Or is it one built on a more enduring foundation of international law, mutual respect, and collective security? The efficacy of any peace process, especially one involving major global powers and these deeply entrenched conflicts, ultimately lies not just in the signed documents or the high-level summits, but in the sustained commitment to equitable implementation and genuine respect for all parties involved even, and perhaps especially those without a seat at the main table.